welcome to this video in which I'm going to address just one aspect of registrational practice in the organ music of 17th century German composer Matthias Weckmann. What I find really fascinating about his organ music is that, number one, we have historical documentation that are within the North German tablatures in which his music was preserved that show very particular registrations, and they're also particular to the North German Baroque organs. In this video, I will highlight just one of these really fascinating registrations from one of the verses, and I'm going to demonstrate a little bit later so that you can hear the context. Essentially, Weckmann was an organist slash improviser slash composer who really knew how to showcase the organ as an instrument to its very best advantage. He was very thoughtful in the way that he approached his music. It's absolutely inspiring to me to see how Weckmann would envision possibilities on the organ, and he would absolutely try out so many different combinations and artistically really bring forth something that is truly inspiring. I think just to any artist who enjoys creative possibility, this is something really to look at for your own journey as well. Weckmann, just like his teacher Jacob Praetorius before him, truly highlighted the text that they were working with in the liturgy through their registrational practice. What I mean is, they used colorful, diverse, contrasting and interesting registrations to support the texts, to highlight the texts, to really bring out meaning in these texts. Just a very brief bio on Weckmann. As a young boy, he was taken into the care of Heinrich Schütz in Dresden at the court chapel there, where he sang as a choir boy. More specifically, he was a descantist, which meant that he was a boy soprano soloist, basically. However, he had begun organ lessons with Johann Klemme, and Schütz recognized this talent in Weckmann and decided to invest personally in Weckmann's education and sent him to Hamburg to study with renowned virtuoso and respected contrapuntist Jacob Praetorius at St. Petri in Hamburg, and this was on a scholarship. So absolutely wonderful that Weckmann had the aptitude and took to this like a fish to water. He absolutely thrived under Praetorius' mentorship and really distinguished himself. So he became a professional organist and learned fascinating techniques in improvisation, in composition, and in registration, which we're focusing on today. Just like Jacob Praetorius was really renowned for this art of registration, we have documentation and quotations by both Jakob Kortkamp and Johann Mattheson supporting this claim. Weckmann too learned this art and applied this, and this is what we see in the Lüneburg tablatures when we examine the manuscript. So particularly manuscript signature KN209, which contains the giant chorale cycle by Weckmann called Es ist das Heil uns kommen her, which translates to salvation is come down to us. It's a huge Reformation theology chorale jam-packed with theology in several verses. Weckmann only said 7, and I'm only going to look at the 3rd verse today. Just very quick, let's look at that inscription. Essentially what it says is Tertius versus, which means 3rd verse, auf zwei Klavier, which means on 2 keyboards. That means you're going to have a solo voice on one keyboard and the accompanimental voice on another keyboard, and the pedal has the cantus firmus melody. Very interesting. It says Rückpositiv, Principal 8. So on the Rückpositiv manual, you're going to have one principal 8 foot. It's a very clear, very resonant, very beautiful stop that's going to serve as our accompaniment voice. Then Pedal, Trompete 8 und gedeckt 8 oder Trompete 4 Fuß. So that means in the pedal you have either the trumpet 8 with a gedeckt 8 Or you have the option of putting trumpet 4. Very interesting. Of course, then you'll play the cantus firmus an octave lower, which is what I'll show you when we get to the demonstration. And then it says in der Orgel. So when it says in der Orgel, it is assumed to mean the Hauptwerk or the main manual. Trompete 16 Fuß. Oh my goodness. Trumpet 16 as the solo voice. Just imagine that. Just think about it. I mean, Hamburg, St. Jacobi, which is the organ where Weckmann played during his position in Hamburg from 1655 to 1674, had 4 manuals, and it did have a trumpet 16 on the Hauptwerk. So I encourage you to really go and try this on a real North German Baroque organ. The trumpet 16 has got a very particular color, very beautiful. Unfortunately, in this demonstration, you won't hear that particular trumpet 16. I'm going to use a different 16 foot, but you'll get the idea. Gonna jump ahead to where the pedal comes in as the cantus firmus in measure 25. I'm gonna play just a few measures before that, just to lead up to it. Middle of 21. So. Hopefully this inspires you to check out Weckmann's entire cycle, which is just a wonderful, wonderful piece. Thank you.
So welcome to Holy Family Church, the oratory, where I'm speaking to you from the console of the Ney organ redone by Hal Gober. And I'm going to talk to you about the organ music of the Spanish Baroque, the tradition of the Tiento. And this is music that is very little known to North American organists. We play a lot of German music, we play a lot of French music often, and perhaps we have some exposure to Italian and English Baroque music. But the Spanish tradition is mostly unknown, and this is very unfortunate because it's a very rich tradition, it's a long tradition chronologically, and there's some very beautiful selections. And in particular, there's some very beautiful pieces of slow music in this repertoire, which is very useful liturgically as meditative, expressive preludes. Very nice in concert to have a fairly long more meditative piece, and incredibly expressive and beautiful. And so this is a good repertoire to have in our minds and in our fingers. So when we talk about the Spanish Baroque repertoire, we can find this now on IMSLP online. A lot of the music is available. There's a Tiento category on IMSLP. There's also these books from Faber, the Faber Early Music series, which give you some performance practice indications and sort of a general anthology of repertoire by different composers from these different periods of Spanish and Portuguese organ music. And of course, once you get to know the composers, you may want to get collections of single composers' works or complete works of the three C's. Cabezon, Correa, and Cabanillas are the main figures here. And Cabezon is a Renaissance composer. He's writing in the middle of the 16th century. With Correa, his major publication is in 1626, so we're looking at the early 17th century Baroque, similar time period to someone like Scheidemann in the German tradition. And then Cabanillas is fairly close in dates to J.S. Bach, so the end of the Baroque. And so with these three people and their contemporaries and successors, we have a 200-year time span, 2 centuries between around 1550 and 1750, let's say, and lots of very beautiful music here. So the piece that I'm going to demonstrate is a Tiento de medio registro by Correa. And medio registro means that the keyboard is divided in the middle. So these organs of the time in Spain and Portugal had one manual without pedal, but in Spain there's the development of the divided keyboard so that you could choose one set of stops that would play in the bass and another set of stops in the treble, so you could have a right hand or a left hand solo all on one keyboard. So there's two things that we need to consider with this repertoire that are important to know about. One is ornamentation, the other is registration. Now for the ornamentation tradition, there's two main kinds of ornaments. There's the quiebro and the redoble. And the quiebro is basically what we would think of as a mordent. That's your simplest kind of quiebro. But there's also the quiebro reiterado, the quiebro that has a turn with it. And this second kind of tiento, the reiterated one with the turn, is the one that Correa tells us we should use always at the beginning of any long, complicated piece, at the beginning of the piece, and then again when each voice enters. And so we're going to point out the entry of the soprano, alto, tenor, and so on as they come in with this quiebro ornament. And one thing that's different with this tradition of ornamentation from the kind of ornaments that we might be familiar with is that we're used mostly to French ornamentation and of course to the music of Bach, who's very much influenced by French ornamentation, where the ornament is an accented dissonance on the beat that resolves later in the bar. So you have something like, but on the downbeat of the bar we've got a dissonant note and it's going to resolve later, accented dissonance on the upper auxiliary that goes down to the main note. And what we have here is an idea of ornamentation that is mostly supposed to be very fast, and that's sort of filling in the middle of the beat, or in between beats in the middle of the bar. And so the quiebro, from what we can tell, always played very fast and always played before the downbeat, so that it's not badalada, but it's badalada. It's always preceding the beat. And then this is important when we talk about the redoble. The redoble is not a sort of accented trill like we have in the French tradition, but something like there's this lead in, the trill happens, and it leads you into the downbeat. So it's kind of a drum roll before the beat. And you can also have it from 2 notes below the trill. So that's your quiebro and your redoble. And there's also the option of more complicated kinds of ornamentation, what we would call glossas in this tradition, where we have decorations that fill in missing notes, that filling in a large interval, or instead of going down one note, you would do. And these kinds of figures are used in Correa's actual music, and so you can take figures out of the music that he writes and use them to create sort of improvised additions. So those are our options here for ornamentation. When we talk about registration, with these tientos de medio registro, we want two different registrations in the right and left hand. And the organs of this time have basically three kinds of stops. They have a principal chorus with principals at 8/4-2 and mixtures. They have flutes and quint flutes, mutation, pitched flutes. And they also have reeds. And at this time in the 17th century, they don't yet have the horizontal reeds, the chamade reeds, that will come later, that we associate with Spanish music of the later Baroque. It's just regular vertical reeds in the case. So you have a few options if you want a solo and accompaniment. You can have, for a quieter version, you can have a flute and then a principal as a solo against that flute, and that can be very effective for a more intimate kind of registration. You can, of course, have the reed as your solo, and maybe you put some flutes and mutation flutes with that reed for support and to kind of make it a little bit less intense. And in that case, you would probably use your principal as the accompanying voice. And then probably the most effective for a treble solo is some kind of mutation combination in the right hand. And the organs of this time mostly have quint mutations, so what you would call the Nazard and the Larigot, 2 2/3 and 1 1/3 pitches. They don't have tierce pitches so often. The sort of cornet sound is a little bit more French than Spanish, but they do have them occasionally. And this works very well on this organ, a kind of cornet type solo with a tierce, because this is a very French style organ, and so this is what I'm going to use here. Basically a tierce type of combination. Just being aware that this is maybe not the most classic Spanish kind of combination, but I don't have the higher pitched quints that I would want to use for a more maybe authentic sound. So there's two problems that we run into with the logistics of playing this particular piece, which is a tiento de medio registro with two voices in the solo. So there's going to be two different parts on the solo sound. If we have one manual with a divide in the middle, it's possible to play in such a way that your left-hand thumb is on the solo part and the rest of your hand is on the accompaniment sound. But we can't do that if we have a modern organ, because we're going to play this on two manuals. And that means that for that thumb that's on the solo sound, we have to thumb down. And it only works if we thumb down. We can't do this, it's not going to work. So we have to have the solo sound on a manual physically lower, the next manual down from whatever accompaniment is. Play on the great with the solo on the choir, or accompany on the swell with the solo on the great. So that's the first thing we have to be aware of. The other thing we have to be aware of is that we're going to need to couple the pedal down for stretches in the left hand that we can't reach. And we need to do this because the organs at the time, like the organ at Knox College in Toronto and most organs of the 17th century, had the short octave. And so the bottom octave of the keyboard is missing a bunch of its black keys. There's no C sharp, D sharp, and so on. All the keys are smushed into a smaller space. And that means that you can reach enormous intervals. You can reach a 12th and 11th. Even if you have tiny hands, you can reach these huge intervals and play big, widely spaced chords with your left hand. On the modern keyboard, the keys are farther apart. We can't do that. So we have to couple the bottom manual, the accompaniment manual, down to the pedal in order to get the same effect. So I'm going to play the opening of this tiento with two solo voices in the treble by Correa, and you're going to hear everything that I've talked about in this opening. So the ornaments, the quiebro and the redoble, the registration with the principal in the left hand and a solo mutation combination in the right, thumbing down when we need to go across the divide in the divided keyboard, and playing notes that you can't reach in the left hand with the pedal coupler. And this is one of the more complicated situations because we've got two solo voices. Most tientos that you're going to encounter are not this complicated. And so this is sort of an extreme example. If you can get your head around this, the other pieces that you're going to play are going to be a lot more straightforward. So here's just the opening of this piece. So that's all I'm going to play of this wonderful piece. Of course, there's a lot of recordings on YouTube. You can hear some of my recordings on the Toronto Oratory channel, as well as some on historic instruments by different players. All of Korea has been recorded on CD quite recently. And so there's lots of opportunities for you to explore this repertoire. So stay safe, keep busy, enjoy this music, which is great to learn. Even if you only have access to a piano or a keyboard, this is manuals only music, and so you can learn it without an organ. Thanks very much.
Thank you for joining us for this lecture series presented by the RCCO Toronto Centre. Today, I'd like to speak about a really fascinating cultural treasure in our city, an Antiphoner in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library, with texts and chants for the celebration of the Divine Office. Its liturgical content covers a period from the first Sunday of Lent to the vigil of the Feast of the Ascension. But this manuscript is much more than just a chant book. It contains layers of history, and we can learn a lot about trends in liturgy, music, paleography, visual art, and even forgery through the study of its chants, scripts, marginalia, and illuminations. With a bit of detective work, we can figure out who used the Antiphoner, where and when it may have been copied, how its purpose changed over time, and why certain aspects of it are just a little bit weird. But before we investigate all of these questions, let's take a look at the first page of the manuscript. The very first chant in the book is the Magnificat antiphon for First Vespers on the first Sunday of Lent, Tunc Invocabis, which would have been sung before and after the Magnificat. The T and U are decorated with gorgeous Lombard initials, featuring tile and clover designs. At the end of the chant, you can see Mag written under a psalm tone ending. This tells us that the chant is in mode 7, and that the Magnificat would have been sung to psalm tone 7, with the variant or differentia that ends on A. This is followed by a versicle and a rubric, indicating that the following texts are for the night office, or matins. There is no music for these antiphons and responsories, which implies that the community using the Antiphoner may have spoken the night office, or chanted it on a common tone. However, there is music for the night office during Holy Week and the octave of Easter, as well as all of the other offices: lauds, prime, terce, sext, non, vespers, and compline. But what about the elephant in the room? There is a large illuminated P with a nativity scene. It obscures the chants and text beneath it, none of which start with the letter P, and a nativity scene has absolutely nothing to do with the first Sunday of Lent. This book is full of similar strange illuminations, which were painted over chants and texts, but have absolutely no relation to them. When were these added, and why? We'll find out, but first, let's answer a few questions about the original manuscript. The first issue to investigate is who, or which liturgical community would have used this book. The easiest way to figure this out would be to find some saints' days, since the presence or absence of a certain feast in the Sanctorale could be a strong suggestion of a manuscript's liturgical tradition. But, unfortunately, this Antiphoner only includes chants for the Temporale, so there are no saints' days. A more complex but equally effective method is to catalog all of the texts and then to compare them, and the order in which they appear, with other manuscripts. A comparison of the language used in rubrics, which are instructions pertaining to ceremonial written in red, will help us reach an even more specific conclusion. For our first comparative study, let's take a look at the night office responsories for the Sacred Triduum, also known as the Tenebrae responsories. French chant scholars like Gabriel Bézac and Dom Raymond Leroux considered these texts to be especially conducive to comparison. Here are the manuscripts we'll use, representing a wide variety of liturgical traditions. So we have antiphoners and breviaries of Franciscan use, Benedictine, Dominican, Carthusian, and some cathedral manuscripts as well. Let's take a look at Maundy Thursday first. I've assigned a letter to each night office responsory, and this table shows the sequence of the responsories in the night office, as they are found in different manuscripts. As you can see, the sequence of responsories in the Fisher Antiphoner, manuscript 09700, matches all of the Franciscan sources, as well as the ordinals assembled by an English Franciscan monk named Hamo, We'll talk about him and his ordinals a bit more later. This strongly suggests that the Fisher antiphonor was for Franciscan use. Let's take a look at the responsories for Good Friday and Holy Saturday to get some more proof. Likewise, we have complete matches with the Franciscan sources. The responsories are the same and in the same order. So here's a table which summarizes our findings, which are a testimony to the wide variety of regional liturgical traditions that existed in Europe before liturgy was standardized at the Council of Trent. Franciscan antiphonors like this one represent the movement towards liturgical uniformity within a certain order. It was extremely expensive to print new books and to distribute them around Europe, especially since all of the bits and pieces needed for a successful service were found in different books. For example, you would need both a breviary and an antiphonor for the Divine Office, at least. Hamo of Faversham, a Franciscan monk and scholar, had an innovative solution for this problem. In the mid-13th century, he wrote ordinals for the Divine Office, which reorganized Franciscan liturgy, indicating the order of chants and text within each service and simplifying the rubrics. Hamo's ordinals contained the corrections necessary to update and standardize the existing books, codifying and homogenizing Franciscan liturgy. Because they did not include complete texts, they were inexpensive to produce and thus widely distributed. Franciscans used the ordinals to make corrections to whichever books they had, and as a basis for new books, like this antiphonor. This standardization was so successful that the Tridentine Breviary of 1568 was also based on Hamo's ordinals, with some changes. Thus, Franciscan liturgy had a very strong influence on Roman Catholic liturgy as a whole. If we want to be absolutely sure that the Fisher antiphonor is a Franciscan book based on Hamo's ordinals, we can take a look at the rubrics. Hamo replaced the regular breviary's flowery language with concise and direct Latin, similar to the rubrics that prevailed in the Sarum liturgy of his native England. Compare these rubrics for Compline on Easter Sunday. And how about these for Lauds on Maundy Thursday? The language in Hamo's ordinal and manuscript 09700, the Fisher antiphonor, is pretty much the same. The language in the regular breviary is a lot less concise and has a lot of superfluous information. Overall, it's just a lot less clear. So I think we can safely conclude that this manuscript is a Franciscan antiphonor copied after the promulgation of Hamo's ordinals. The next question to consider is where the antiphonor was copied. Many catalogs say that the manuscript is Italian, and some are more specific, speculating that the manuscript is from Florence. The use of a Gothic rotunda script suggests that Italy is a strong possibility. This bookhand emerged in 12th century Italy and was popular for liturgical books throughout the Renaissance and later. However, variations of it were also used in Spain, Portugal, and southern France, so we need a bit more proof. The scribal abbreviations might help us out. This particular abbreviation for qui is very characteristic of Italian manuscripts. Likewise, this abbreviation of the dative or ablative ending bus indicates that the antiphonor is probably Italian. It's the B followed by the backward C. To the right, the shape of the Turonian et sign with a curved shaft, no cross, and a bow to the left of the horizontal stroke is also quite typical of Italian manuscripts. So, on what grounds do some catalog entries speculate that the Fisher antiphonor is Florentine? Many of the peculiar illuminations painted over the chants depict Florentine musicians, here we have Francesco Landini, and scenes from Florentine artwork, but these illuminations have nothing to do with the original manuscript. As the illuminations were added long after the manuscript was copied, their content is irrelevant to the antiphonor's origin. Examination of certain Latin spelling conventions in the text reveal that the manuscript was likely copied in northern Italy, not Florence. Ti, ci, is found in certain words where you would expect to see chi, ci. In northern Italy, C before E and I was pronounced as TS, ts, whereas it was pronounced ch in Tuscany, just as in modern Italian and modern Italian in Latin. For example, here we see sacrificium, not sacrificium, et respiциentes instead of et respiциentes. Similarly, in Latin, X was pronounced as S in northern Italy, but not in Tuscany. In this rubric for Maundy Thursday, extiguitur is written as estiguitur, further proof that the Fischer antiphonor was copied in northern Italy. So, how can we know when it was copied? Well, this question is the most difficult to answer precisely. The antiphonor's liturgical content indicates that it was copied sometime between the promulgation of Haemus Ordinals in the mid-13th century and Pius V's 1568 Tridentine Breviary. But what's this? A possible lead? These pages have revisions in the margins. By a later hand, they instruct the user of the antiphonor to change the order of some night office responsories during the octave of Easter. Here, Congratulamini mihi is to be swapped with Surrexit Pastor bonus. And here, Tularunt Dominum with De ore prudentis. The phrase verte signum rubrum appears on both pages, and it informs the user of the antiphonor that some sort of red sign will indicate where in the book the correct texts are. There it is. These liturgical revisions are in accordance with the 1568 Tridentine Breviary, but I wonder if they could have happened within the Franciscan order sometime before the Council of Trent. If we can find some sort of addendum to Haemus Ordinals with these revisions, we may be able to date the Fischer antiphonor more precisely. So, let's check out some Franciscan bulls. Not that kind. Okay, so if you look through the Bullarium Franciscanum, you won't find any liturgical revisions that pertain to these night office responsories, which means this is a dead end. Most catalog entries on the Fischer antiphonor list it as a late 15th century manuscript, and this seems like a very fair estimate to me, although there is no way to be absolutely sure. Finally, let's discuss the manuscript's most interesting feature, the notorious illuminations that were painted over the chants. I think it's almost impossible that these miniatures are from the Renaissance, as some catalog entries and at least one academic paper suggest. Firstly, it is unlikely that illuminations would be painted directly over existing chants in the 15th or 16th century. When a correction or alteration to a manuscript was necessary, the existing material would be scraped off, as we see here. The fact that these illuminations are completely unrelated to the chants that they obscure implies that the antiphonor no longer functioned as a liturgical book when it was illuminated. Instead, it probably became a collector's item. In legitimate Renaissance miniatures, there is great attention to detail, as well as subtly blended colors, perspective, shadow, depth, and realistic proportions. On the left here, the Annunciation, and on the right, the Martyrdom of St. Stephen. So the artistic features of the illuminations in the Fischer antiphonor quickly betray them as forgeries, perhaps from the 19th century, when forgery of Renaissance art was common. Many of the illuminations in the Fischer antiphonor are copies from the Squarcialupi Codex, a manuscript of 14th century Florentine polyphony. In the Fischer antiphonor, clear white strokes and lines are present in most of the illuminations, perhaps to give the illusion of depth or perspective. In legitimate Renaissance miniatures, perspective is the result of careful blending of colors, and there are few blatant white strokes. The faces are realistic and appear to be three-dimensional. But the faces in the counterfeit illuminations are flat and two-dimensional, with unrealistic proportions. Here is Antonio Zaccara di Taramo's portrait from the Squarcialupi Codex, and here is the forgery in the Fischer antiphonor. In the original, the subject is depicted at an angle, so only part of his left eye is visible. In the forgery, the composer is facing front, but his eyes are not the same size or shape, and the border of his face is not clearly defined. Here's another miniature we can compare. Again, it's the famous organist from Florence, Francesco Landini. And the forgery? So, compare their faces, the subtle blending of colors, their garments, the sense of depth and perspective, the use of gold. On the left, we probably have gold leaf, and on the right, probably gold paint. We also have 3 plucked string instruments, The bottom one is a gittern, which was a very well-known instrument in the Renaissance. People even played it in barbershops. And it has this characteristic teardrop shape. So it looks like the artist of the forgery didn't really know what these instruments looked like. Another hint that he probably wasn't from the Renaissance. His gittern looks more like a banjo. It appears that the artist of the Fischer illuminations was unfamiliar with how religious figures were depicted in Renaissance miniatures. Many of the forgeries only copy part of the original work, removing a religious figure from its usual context. For example, this illumination shows the Madonna in adoration. Books of Hours frequently depicted Mary with Christ, as a child, in ministry, or after his crucifixion. But the problem here is that Mary is alone in this position, and the subject of her adoration is not present. So, the painting is devoid of its original context and meaning. Likewise, this illumination depicts the Virgin and Child, perhaps copied from da Fabriano's Strozzi altarpiece. In the illumination, they are looking to the right, as if responding to something. In the Strozzi altarpiece, the three magi are at the feet of the Virgin and Child, in adoration, but they are not in the forged illumination. It seems highly unlikely that a Renaissance artist would have painted them in such a posture without including the magi. If you're still not convinced, there is even more evidence that these illuminations are from centuries after the Renaissance. Here's another forgery copied from the Squarcialupi Codex. Unlike in the original manuscript, he is holding a book with musical notation. Let's zoom in. A close examination of the notation reveals groups of 4 to 5 notes beamed together, resembling modern 8th or 16th notes. A Renaissance artist would have depicted Gregorian neumes as part of the illumination, as Zanobi Strozzi does in his Singing Monks. Strozzi's miniature is so clear and detailed that one can read and sing the chant within it, and the notation of the chant accurately reflects notational practices from the period. The score in the forgery even appears to have a 4/4 time signature on the left page bottom staff. Pretty suspicious. The original scribe did include some decorated initials. The smallest ones, which occur at the beginning of each chant, are decorated with 3 columns, written with an extremely thin stroke behind the letter. They are rarely larger than the letter itself, and any flourishes and lines extending from them are minimal. The larger Lombard initials are box-like, with tile and clover designs, and white paint is used along with red and blue. So, why would anyone want to fill an already beautiful chant book with phony illuminations? I think these might be a product of the renewed interest in Renaissance art which emerged in the late 18th century and continued throughout the 19th century. After the first public museums were established, the upper class began to fill their homes with private collections of paintings and sculptures. As a result, there was an extremely high demand for Renaissance art, and it started to become scarce. When a piece was sold, a replica was often requested by the seller, and this began an era of forgery. The authenticity of a work was irrelevant to the owners of private collections who were more interested in the aesthetics and the sentimental or spiritual value of the objects. It is quite possible that the forged illuminations in the Fischer Antiphoner are a product of this age and mentality. Thank you for tuning in. I hope when things open up you go to the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library in Robarts and take a look at this magnificent book. Before then, you can take a look online. The entire manuscript has been digitized. Just look up Antiphonarium et Breviarium in the U of T library system, and you can see a scan of the whole thing. Thank you, and I look forward to the presentations of my colleagues.